Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this update or instruction course, whatever you call it, on keratoconus. It's been a very hot topic, and it's my pleasure to invite you all to this interesting course. Keratoconus, as you know, the incidence varies from something like 0.03% to 2.3% based on different geographical locations. Earlier, there was no treatment worth mentioning for keratoconus as well as ectasia. But of late, in the last 1.5 decades, so many changes have taken place. And definitely, we feel privileged that we can do something for this very, very agonizing condition. So I have with me a mix of young as well as old. I am supposed to be the chief instructor for this. The chief instructor designation comes to me because of my age, not because I'm in any way better than the other panelists. Probably all of them are more equipped to talk on this than me. I have with me Dr. Lumbini, who has done her MS and fellowship in cornea and refractive surgery from Arvind Eye Hospital. She has won multiple gold medals, both at the undergraduate as well as the postgraduate level. She has been awarded for her papers and her presentations in TOS and Keracon, and she has a few papers of interest. Her main area of interest has been corneal ulcers, keratoconus, and lamellar keratoplasty. She is at present a consultant in her own clinic, which is called a Shiva Eye Clinic at Hyderabad. Next, we come up to Rishi Swarup. Dr. Lumbini will be talking to us on clinical features and management algorithms for keratoconus. Then Dr. Rishi Swarup, I don't think needs any introduction, is probably one of the youngest and most popular corneal surgeons today in India. He's got many courses, both at the national as well as the international level. He has done his MBBS from Manipal and his diploma from Vellore. He has done his corneal fellowship from Shankar Netralaya. He's an FRCS from Glasgow. He has won multiple, again, gold medals at the undergraduate as well as the postgraduate level. He's honorary secretary of Hyderabad Ophthalmologists Association, editor, TOS publications, and he's section editor for cornea of the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. He has won many awards, among them being Achievement Award of the American Academy of Ophthalmology, the C.S. Reshmi Endowment Lecture, the IARSI Gold Medal Delhi, and so many other things. His main area of interest, again, has been lamellar corneal surgery. He's got many, many papers in the field of keratoconus. He is a nature lover, fitness enthusiast, and an amateur photographer. Murli Asuri, again, I don't think he needs much introduction. He has done, after his graduation and post-graduation from Osmania Medical College, Hyderabad, he was a fellow in cornea and subsequently a consultant for anterior segment in the prestigious L.V. Prasad Eye Institute. After that, he has been into private practice. His area of interest is pediatric cataract surgery, refractive surgery, corneal transplants, and contact lenses. Dr. Madhukar Reddy is not there with us. And I, after my post-graduation in Hyderabad, I have worked for a short time in Africa and then a short stint at Japan, following which I have been in private practice. I basically manage the laser center in Hyderabad, to which all of us belong. So with this short introduction, I request Dr. Lumbini to go ahead and give her talk. Dr. Rishi will be talking to us both on keratoplasty as well as collagen cross-linking, and Dr. Murli will enlighten us about contact lenses in keratoconus.
Sir, are my slides visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So at the outset, good afternoon, one and all. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Nandakishore sir for giving me this opportunity. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll be talking about keratoconus clinical science and management algorithm. So here are a few pictures of bulges of the cornea, where the topmost picture shows keratoconus, the other being the pellucid marginal degeneration. This is a Tyrrhen's marginal degeneration showing superior thinning, and the keratoglobus, as the name suggests, where there's global. Know that keratoconus is the most common corneal ectasia. It is progressive in nature, and the incidence is about 2.3% in central India and is known to be 4 times more common in the Asians, particularly in the Indians, in the Middle East group, and also in the Southeast Asians. It is thought to have an early onset, sometime around puberty. Sometimes we are seeing cases even earlier, and gets arrested to around about 3rd or 4th decade of life. It's usually bilateral, but sometimes may present as asymmetrical. Next, coming to the presentation. So how does a patient of keratoconus come to us? So when he walks into the clinic, his basic complaint will be blurred vision. That is, he can see an object, but he says it's not very clear. And most of these patients with moderate to advanced keratoconus say that they have problems while driving in the night because of the light. This is probably because at the night time, when there is a dilated pupil and the cone being more inferior, that causes very difficulty in seeing the light, and they experience these symptoms as like glare, halos, or ghosting of the images. The other important presentation would be a frequent change of glasses, which the patient says. So with this presentation, the next would be the important clinical signs. Now, the clinical signs can be divided into those seen on external examination and those seen on slit lamp, which are most definitive. These external examination signs, since these signs are more subjective and can be seen only in advanced cases, they are very subjective. So in this, the first most common sign which we see is the Munson sign. This is nothing but when a keratoconus patient is asked to look down, if you observe, the cone of the cornea tends to push the lower lid more anteriorly, causing a bulge. And this is known as the Munson sign. And in my second picture, this is called as a Rizzuti sign, where when a light is shown on the temporal part of the cornea, in a normal patient, this is illuminated as a bright arc on the nasal limbus. But whereas in a keratoconus patient, you see that this light tends to focus on the nasal point as like an arrow. And this is called the Rizzuti sign. Next is the oil droplet. Oil droplet reflex, as the name suggests, is like when you have a dilated pupil of a keratoconus patient, and on distant direct ophthalmoscopy, you see that the area of the cone is seen as a dark reflex resembling an oil droplet. Next, coming to the most definitive slit lamp signs, the first and most important is ectasia and thinning. Even this ectasia is a little more subjective because it's only seen very clearly on slit lamp at an advanced stage. The other important signs are the Flesher's ring. Now, Flesher's ring is the most common and one of the earliest signs of keratoconus which we see. This is nothing but iron deposition at the epithelial level of the cornea. Now, this iron deposition, which gives us an idea about the size of the cone. So if you see, usually the iron gets deposited along the edges of the cone, and that is because that is where the stasis of the tear film occurs, and the iron from the tear film gets deposited in these epithelial cells. And one more important point is this is better seen when you put a cobalt blue filter rather than on the normal light. And the next one is the Vaux striae. Now, what are these Vaux striae? These are nothing but vertical lines which are seen in the posterior part of the stroma. They are typically told in the textbooks that when you apply pressure, these disappear and they return back when you loosen them. The important point about Vaux striae is you should remember that they're not seen in the decimes, but in fact, they're seen in the stromal part. The next feature is acute hydrops. This is quite rarely seen now because of patients presenting quite early, and also because of the latest diagnostic modalities which are catching keratoconus at an earlier stage. But if the patient has a very advanced keratoconus and the cornea is very thinned out, there may be a tear in the decimes which causes the aqueous to move into the stroma, causing hydrops. And once the hydrops resolves, this can cause a deep stromal scar in the form of a decimal scarring. And this is very important to differentiate from apical scarring, because apical scarring is caused when there is breakdown of the epithelium and that grows back into the cornea. Why is it important to differentiate between apical and decimes? Is because the mode of management will differ. The next important sign is a scissor reflex. This is one of the earliest signs which is seen in keratoconus. And here it's nothing but when you do retinoscopy, when you normally in a retinoscopy, when you see light reflex either which moves with or against or parallel to the light. But in keratoconus patients, you see that there is a split of this light reflex resembling like a scissors. Hence the name scissors reflex. This is very important because amongst all the signs, this is one of the earliest signs seen in a keratoconus patients. So once you see that a patient has signs of allergy, now the other signs of allergy include looking for patient's upper papillary conjunctiva. It's always important to avert his lid to look for signs of papilla, especially in cases of vernal keratoconjunctivitis. And one of the more important features is history of eye rubbing. Always ask the patient for history of eye rubbing because it is known that this is one of the most important feature causing progression of keratoconus. So once you have a patient of keratoconus, how do you evaluate him? So based on his subjective symptoms, and when you check his visual acuity, you see that his best corrected visual acuity does not improve to 20/20, or when you do his refraction, you see a very high cylinder or very asymmetric type of a refractive error. And the most sensitive and the most important diagnostic modality will be corneal topography, which will identify keratoconus at a very early stage. The details of this will be in detail by my subsequent speaker, but I just wanted to stress that there are three important features which you have to look for in topography. That is the central curvature of the cornea, and if you have any asymmetry of the cornea, that is in a normal cornea, you see that the superior and the inferior surfaces are similar, whereas in a keratoconus patient, you see there is an asymmetry, and also if there is thinning of the cornea. So these are the three important characteristic features of a patient having keratoconus on corneal topography. Him, the classification is the modified, which we have been following, is a modified Amsler-Pumme classification, which take presence of scarring or how much is the corneal thickness. And once you have classified keratoconus as early or advanced or grade 4 keratoconus, then you have to evaluate progression. Now, how do we evaluate progression? Again, topography is the most important and sensitive indicator because very early and subtle progression you cannot know clinically. And who are the patients whom you need to close follow-up? Those are the patients who are of younger age, patients who have any allergies, who have history of eye rubbing, or who give history of frequent change of glasses. So how do you define progression? Global consensus on keratoconus and ectatic diseases have defined progression as if you have the steepest or the flattest meridian change of a keratometric change of more than 1 diopter from the baseline, or if you have a mean keratometric change of more than 0.75 diopters, or if the corneal thickness decreases 2% from the baseline, it is defined as progression. So once you know that the patient is diagnosed as keratoconus, he has progression, then how do you manage it? Now, keratoconus is a disease which have a particular optimal treatment or a particular protocol for its management. It's all based upon a particular patient's corneal parameters, which we look in. So with this in mind, I have devised a flow chart where suppose when you identify a patient with keratoconus, the first thing is you evaluate him with the help of clinical signs and corneal topography. And then you divide those patients into progressive types, or whether he's non-progressive or has a low risk of progression. And once you know he's non-progressive, check the patients for visual acuity with glasses and contact lenses. Contact lenses in the form of soft lenses or soft toric lenses. And if they are improving well, you please give them the glasses or contact lenses. And once you notice that these patients are non-progressive, and then you can go for surface correcting procedures like topochited PRK. And suppose if it's a very high cylinder, very regular astigmatism, you can go for a phakic IOL. In the case when there is not improving with glasses or contact lenses, and a patient is having a very high cylinder, not improving with a soft contact lens, you need to go for an RGP lens. If the patient has an eccentric cone or intolerant to that, then you go for a surgical procedure like an implant, which is called as Intacs. Now for Intacs, the main indication is either he should be of intolerant to contact lens, I should not have any kind of stromal scarring. But if the patient is very advanced and all these patient is intolerant to contact lenses, the last resort and has stromal scarring, I think the last resort is keratoplasty in the form of penetrating or deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. Now, each management modality is also being dealt in detail by my subsequent speaker. I'll just rush through the slides. So contact lenses can be soft toric, or a rigid gas permeable lenses. And the latest are the scleral lenses, which are used in very advanced cases. Collagen cross-linking, this has almost changed the face of keratoconus because if you see in the last decade, there is a drastic change in patients going for keratoplasty because you are identifying them early, and in case of progression, you are doing a cross-linking and stabilizing them. So there are different protocols. You have the standard Dresden, you have accelerated protocols, and you have hypoosmolar for thin corneas. The next is topo-guided. As I already discussed, this is basically for regular 50 microns. This is the best option to go for. Intacs, I've already told you the indication. And finally, the keratoplasty. In case of advanced cases, go for penetrating. In case of superficial stromal scar, you can go for a lamellar keratoplasty. Dr. Shetty et al. Have discussed in their in the paper management protocol called as a 5-point algorithm, where they have given importance to demographics, where they say if the patient has high risk characteristics. Yeah, I'll just 1 minute. If they have high risk characteristics, you give them a grade progress very higher than you. So final slide saying we are still in the phase of understanding keratoconus. There is a lot to still give better treatment for keratoconus, and the most important diagnostic modality is topography, avoid eye rubbing, and the various management options depend upon the patient's situation. And the future of keratoconus is having CXL modifications and also looking at bone layer transplantation for making it more stabilize the cornea and not allowing it to go for keratoplasty. Thank you.
Dr. Nandkishore, you are on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Lumbini, for a comprehensive roundup. I'll try to share my screen.
Okay, sir.
Are you able to see my screen?
So
Yes, sir.
Yeah. My topic sort of overlaps with what Dr. Lumbini has already evaluated to a great extent. But I'll try to stress as much as possible on topography. What are the aims of evaluation? Why do you need to evaluate a case of keratoconus? That's basically you have to differentiate between normal, suspect, and a frank keratoconus. Then to determine what's the right time frame to intervene. If you interfere at a very late stage, maybe you are not doing the right thing. It may be too late to do anything except keratoplasty in these cases. So you need to know the right time to intervene and what type of treatment we have to use. These are the basic aims of evaluating the case of suspect keratoconus. So on clinical examination, she has already dealt in detail with Munson sign, Rizzuti sign, then scissoring reflex, slit lamp findings. All these has been already evaluated in detail by Dr. Lumbini. And one thing about Fleischer ring is it is seen more prominently in earlier cases. As the keratoconus progresses, it becomes more faint because of the thinning of the cornea. Then corneal scarring, which is seen post hydrops. As you all know, topography is a very, very complicated thing to understand. I think it is beyond the capability of ordinary mortals like us, or people who are well versed in physics and physical principles probably understand this much more. So when you are faced with a topography map, when a map is placed in front of you, you often do not understand and it looks like just a jumble and you don't know what to make out of it. You just go by the colors. So to a great extent, you may be correct, but it needs a little more things than that. So when you Pentacam of all the things, it's a rotating shine plug device, and it's considered today as the gold standard for so many things apart from identifying for keratoconus and for evaluating a patient for LASIK. So the important things to look for in a Pentacam are you have to know the QS value, which is the quality specification. Only if the figure or the picture taken is of good quality, then only you should try and start analyzing the map. Then the K1 flat keratometry, you always have to take this into consideration for treating myopia, which should not be more than, the flat keratometry should not be less than 34 diopters. K2, which is the steep keratometry, you always take into consideration by treating hyperopia, and this should not be more than 48 diopters. The Q value or the corneal acuity basically indicates the shape of the cornea, and the bad display, which is of two versions, version 1 and 2. So what does the bad display basically have? It has a front and back elevation maps, which is elevation of the cornea over a best fit sphere. And then the second set of maps has takes into account the raw data, excluding a 3.5 millimeter circle centered on the thinnest point of the cornea. The third set of maps is the difference map between the two maps, which indicates a change in elevation from the standard. So anything, what I'm going to say here, anything which is suspect here, obviously falls into the category of the red flag in a pentacam map. So anything less than 6 microns in front and 8 microns back elevation is indicated by green color and basically indicates it's a normal cornea. Between 6 to 12 front elevation and 8 to 20 microns back elevation is indicated by yellow color, which indicates suspect cases. These are the cases which you have to be very, very careful about. Because frank keratoconus, most of us can identify either on topography or on clinical examination. But these are the cases which suspect cases are the most important, I feel, for us to evaluate further and go in for a proper line of treatment. More than 12 microns front and 20 microns back is indicated by red and is KC compatible. It also has something called as a progressive index, which is an arithmetic average of the thickness from the 1 to 5 millimeter diameter rings, and the average value is about 0.91. Anything above 1.81 and all is a definitely case of keratoconus. The version 2 includes 5 additional parameters and the overall final displacement value of which is indicated by D. In this, which is anything less than 1.6 is normal, between 1.6 to 2.6 is suspect, and again if more than 2.6 is a case of frank keratoconus. So as you can see, you can see all these values here which I have mentioned, the QS, the QS value, and then the progression index. Then what I talked about, the 3 maps, the first set of maps, then the exclusion maps, and then the difference map. So these things at the bottom indicate into which category your case is falling. And finally, in the bad D version 2, these are the pictures which are the figures which indicate whether it is a suspect or a frank keratoconus. Here, most of the things are in red, and as I told you, the values, it is all more than 2.6. Here it is 4, so it is definitely a case of keratoconus. Then red flags, almost all the points which I just now mentioned fall into the red flags category. So, like I told you, any front elevation more than 13 microns to 15 microns is suspect, and more than 15 micron is risk. Back elevation more than 20 should be a case for frank keratoconus, and anything between 18 to 20 you should deal with carefully. Difference between front and back, even though these two values may be in the normal range, if the difference between the front and the back at the same point on the map, if it is more than 5 microns, again you take it as a case of suspect. And these are, why do you need to identify these suspect cases? When you are planning a surgery, whether it is a LASIK, if anything comes in the suspect range, you obviously want to postpone your surgery till such time as you repeat the maps and see if there is any change in these parameters, or you alter your line of treatment. Then any inferior superior asymmetry of more than 30 microns in the 4 millimeter zone, more than 10 microns difference in thickness between apex and thinnest point, not more than 30 micron difference between right and left eyes at the same point on the map. Dr. Lumbini defined progression, but what Dr. Rohit Shetty and all believe is a 0.5 diopter increase in 2 sagittal maps in steep axis in a time frame of 6 months, or a 10% reduction in the thickness at the same point over a 6-month period can be safely defined as progression. And these are the cases which we should think of going in for a collagen cross-linking. Serious topographer is a Schemfleck plus Placido device. It measures more than 21,000 anterior and 16,000 posterior points. It has a 4-map configuration, the thickness, tangential curvature, anterior and posterior elevation maps, and it gives a fairly accurate summary. It applies artificial intelligence to arrive at a diagnosis. It categorizes the map into either a normal keratoconus suspect or a keratoconus compatible. But however, sometimes because of so many improper formatting of the values as per European standards, we might arrive at cases which are not compatible with the Indian conditions. So it is always a good idea to remember these values. As far as the BAT-D of the Pentacam, it corroborates more or less with the 4.5 mm RMS by A value of the back. So these two in cases of frank keratoconus. But whereas if you see suspect cases, probably the Pentacam maps are much better than these values. Why do you need to identify these things? Because basically now it's not just keratoconus treatment does not just involve trying to strengthen the cornea. It also involves trying to make the cornea more regular. So there is a procedure for that, and we need to evaluate take 4 points into consideration, whether the position of the cone, then the Q value, then the amount of error which you plan to correct, and the change it produces. So once you take this, you can go either for a Q value based or a refractive addition based correction, which involves a PRK in addition to a cross-linking. With these few words, I think I'll hand it over to Rishi if Rishi is there. Has Rishi joined?
No, sir, I cannot see him in the participants list yet.
So in that case, because he messaged me saying that he is in another session and will
Yes.
join shortly. So we can go ahead with Dr. Murli.
Sure, sir.
I'll share my screen. The screen,
Sir, I can see your screen. You can go full screen and start.
is it visible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we have the background now of how to go about diagnosing a case of keratoconus and how do we look at the signs and symptoms, and also what do you look for in the topography, which is a key thing to diagnose keratoconus. And also it is very important to do this tests such as topography tests in order to fit contact lenses properly for these cases. Normally for most routine contact lens fitting, you would just depend upon keratometry, but in cases of keratoconus, it would be a good idea to do a topography as well. The reason for that we will see shortly. So primarily the reason why we are troubled with contact lens fitting in cases of keratoconus is for the reason of irregular astigmatism, which is seen with conditions such as keratoconus, post-traumatic or infectious corneal scars, or post-keratoplasty astigmatisms, and post-RK or PRK or LASIK. And this is the major problem in fitting a contact lens, the irregular astigmatism. Because once you have an irregular cornea, the lenses don't center very well, and that causes a problem with the fit of these lenses. The contact lens fitting in cases of irregular corneas, as I was telling you, the topography would give you a good guide on how to go about with fitting the lenses. As you can see in the picture on your extreme left, you can see there is a nipple cone or a central cone where the contact lens fitting would be reasonably easy because the lens is going to be centered. As you see the other cases, the cone, the steep areas are shifting downwards, indicated by the hot spot or the red area. And however hard you may try with the regular contact lenses, the lens is going to shift downwards towards the steep area. That means the centering of the lens will happen over the steep area, however hard you may try with the routine contact lens fitting. Coming to the lenses that we need to we have as options in keratoconus are, as already has been dealt with, we have soft lenses, both spherical as well as the toric lenses, the RGP lenses, the regular rigid gas permeable lenses. As a cutoff point, you can say up to 45 or 46 diopters of steepness, I think you could still try a regular RGP lens for a case of keratoconus. But once your K values shoot up beyond 45, 46, I think it's a good idea to shift to special lenses such as in the soft areas or the RGP, or you even have the hybrid, which is a combination of soft and the rigid lenses. There are situations where you would want to combine a soft lens with an overriding RGP lens, which is called as a piggyback lens system. Situations wherein you have poor comfort with the GP lenses, or you have epithelial problems wherein you want to make an epithelial friendly soft lens sit on top of the cornea and then fit an RGP lens to give clear vision. And in those extreme cases of coning, you would probably shift to semi-scleral or scleral type of contact lenses. In many of the initial stages of keratoconus, many of these patients can be treated with soft contact lenses. The moment you see a keratoconus patient, it does not necessarily always mean you have to use an RGP lens. You may have several patients where you could simply fit a toric contact lens, which gives them reasonably good vision. I don't say they may get 100% clarity in vision, but you can trade off with the kind of comfort that soft lenses provide. You may actually choose a soft toric lens over a RGP lens, because RGP lenses have their own drawbacks in the form of discomfort and intolerance to use. So in the early stages of keratoconus, it may not be a bad idea to try toric soft contact lenses. But as the condition advances, as I said, you may have to depend upon more specialized lenses. One such lens in the soft variety is the Kerasoft lens from Bausch & Lomb. And these lenses have are silicone material made lenses, and they have different curves on the back surface, and which allows them to fit properly on the lens corneal surface. And they have a diameter of about 14.5 millimeters, which allows them to stabilize properly on the cornea. Coming to the RGP lenses, the routine RGP lenses have some role in fitting patients, as I said, those who have steepness of less than 45 diopters. But more often than not, you see these patients of keratoconus wherein you may have to depend upon a special contact lens, such as a Rose K lens. Paul Rose is an optometrist from New Zealand who actually tried out lenses through trial and error, different permutations and combinations, different lenses on these patients, and decided that back surface of the contact lens needs to have different curvatures as against to the traditional RGP lenses. So these are the specialized Rose K lenses, which have the Rose K2 is a more recent option. A little bit about these lenses would be worthwhile. You have the Rose K2 lenses for keratoconus, then you have the Rose K2 for irregular corneas, and then you have Rose K2 post-graft lenses. This is the design of the Rose K lens, wherein you see the lens has a central curvature and a peripheral curvature. You can fit the lens on the cone and not bother about the peripheral part straight away. First, you make sure that you get your central fitting properly. And then, as you can see in the chart below, the figure below on the left bottom side, you can actually change the position of the peripheral flange. So the lens would still be fitting perfectly in the center, but depending on whether you want to elevate the periphery or depress the periphery of the lens, you could do what is called as the changing the vaulting of the lens in the periphery. This allows you to fit a contact lens beautifully in these cases of keratoconus. Another additional feature of the ROSE K2 lenses is called as the asymmetric corneal technology. As we all know, most patients of keratoconus have inferior steepening, which causes a condition called as an edge standoff. You can see in the pictures in the middle, the three pictures, you can see at the bottom of the lens, you can see pooling of the fluorescein, which indicates that the edge of the lens is standing off the cornea. The reason for that is the inferior cornea is steeper in these cases compared to the superior cornea. For these cases, as you can see in the contact lens design on the left of the image, the lens can just be made a little steeper in the inferior part. It doesn't mean that it is in the inferior part of the lens, but the moment you place this lens on the cornea, that aspect of the lens will come and sit on the inferior portion of the cornea. So thereby you can actually stop vaulting of the lens in the inferior part, which is a major reason why the lenses get flicked out of the patient's eye. So many times you would have seen patients of contact keratoconus wearing an RGP lens, but frequently complaining that the lens is getting ejected out. That is because the inferior edge of the lens is standing off, and this can be addressed by ACT technology. The ACT can be grade 1, 2, 3, depending on the severity of the edge standoff. And then you also have what is called as a toric PCs, wherein, in case if you see in the image below the fluorescein picture, the picture on the left shows a typical with the rule astigmatism with the dumbbell pattern of fluorescein staining with a traditional lens. But once you apply the toric PC technology, this dumbbell pattern tends to disappear, and actually the contact points in the 3 and 9 o'clock meridian, they have disappeared, and there is more uniform staining now that can be seen. So toric PCs, ACT technology, vaulting of the lens periphery can all be combined nicely to give you a clear, beautiful fit of the lens, as you can see in the right below picture of the fluorescein. But however hard you may try in the advanced cases of keratoconus, the fit may not be perfectly defined. In such cases, you will have to depend upon the more advanced contact lenses, which are called as in case of the combination of soft and RGP, these are called as the hybrid lenses. In this lens, which is made by Synergise, called as a clear cone lens, you have a central RGP lens with a skirt of HEMA, that is soft material. So, and make sure that you don't stain these lenses with normal fluorescein, because the skirt around will get stained and the fluorescein will enter into the lens. You always have to use the high molecular weight fluorescein only. That you have to keep in mind. These lenses tend to address two major issues. One, because their diameter is large, stability is not going to be an issue. They don't come out of the eye easily. And second, because they have an RGP material in the center, they can address the irregular astigmatism very well. So the vision of the patient is very good. What you try to do in this lens fitting is try to get a minimal fluorescein film in the center with little bit of fluorescein towards the periphery.
Please conclude, sir.
Yep. This is just a video which shows you clear cone trial box.
I'm sorry, sir.
Video.
Has Dr. Rishi joined in?
This is a 15-minute presentation. So
Yes, I'm here.
You have a lens carrying thing, and also a cobalt blue torch, which helps in seeing the fit from outside using the slit lamp. High molecular fluorescein I was talking about. You can see the lens there. MPS solution, or you could even use preservative-free saline solution for these cases. You have to fill it till the brim. and then apply the sodium fluorescein, the high molecular weight one. You have to place it in the patient's eye. You can see it's a steep fit with an air bubble trap there. Whenever there is an air bubble, you make sure that you remove again and place it again so that there is no bubble there. The fit here is little on the steeper side. You would want a more lighter amount of fluorescein to be there in the behind the lens. Even a small bubble should not be there behind the lens. When you are placing, you have to remove and reapply. Coming to this last lens that I wanted to impress on you is the ROSE K2 XL lens, which is the more advanced or semi-scleral type of lens, wherein you have this trial set with different types of lenses. You again have the lens inserter, which helps you in placing the lens into the patient's eye, and also it helps in removing it. This is the lens, and this lens is again a large 14.5 millimeter diameter lens. You fill this lens till the brim, as you did with the previous clear cone lens. You can use a normal fluorescein here because this is not going to get stained by the normal fluorescein. But in case of a clear cone lens, you have to make sure that you have applied the high molecular weight fluorescein. Make sure that the patient's head is absolutely horizontal and eye is looking absolutely down. Make them look down and just apply the lens. So all that you need to do is just go and touch the eye and it will get sucked onto the cornea. Which means the application is either wrong or the fit is too steep. The light touch in the center. Most patients of keratoconus, the important thing to remember is you should try to achieve a feather touch in the center. By getting a feather touch in the center, one, you would have excellent vision, which means there is a little compression on the cone of the cornea, which in turn removes all the disturbing double vision or the ghosting of the image, which is critical. You may have a beautiful fit on the lens on the cornea, but the patient may be complaining of ghosting. That is because you fail to touch the cornea faintly in the center with the contact lens. But at the same time, avoid touching the cornea too much because that would in turn lead to long-term scarring of the cornea. So you have to have the right balance for fitting these lenses. Thank you.
Thank you, Murli, for that exhaustive talk on contact lenses. We really got a lot of insight into this because most of us are not doing this scleral and hybrid lenses. So you showed a very nice demonstration. We next go on to Dr. Rishi Swarup, who will first talk about collagen cross-linking and then go on to keratoplast.
Thank you, Dr. Nandankishore, for involving me in this wonderful IC. And sorry I'm late. I was caught up in another session parallelly. Is my slide visible?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just get started. So actually, this was Dr. Madhukar Reddy's talk, but he had to be away. So I'm taking his topic of collagen cross-linking, a current update. So cross-linking is something we have actually borrowed from our dental colleagues, just like phacoemulsification also was kind of inspired from dentist procedure. They use ultraviolet light routinely to fix dental fillings and harden them. And essentially, that's a similar kind of thing that we are doing in the cornea. We are instilling a dye, photosensitizing dye into the cornea, and then we are applying UV light of a particular wavelength to cause a kind of a chemical reaction and collagen bonds, covalent bonds between collagen fibers of the anterior stroma. So what are the indications? Essentially, the main indication is, of course, ectasia. In keratoconus, we typically like to do it in progressive keratoconus, but there is increasing argument for doing it as a primary procedure, especially if you have young patients, female patients who are likely to have future pregnancies or have thyroid, or even in older patients if you are seeing a progression, clear-cut evidence of progression. Post-LASIK ectasias we know are known to progress rapidly. So as soon as you see a post-LASIK ectasia, it is an indication for cross-linking. Peripheral ectasias are a relative indications because cross-linking is not as effective. So if you have like a pellucid, you may not be able to effectively stop it with cross-linking, but some people have shown success with cross-linking. So we could try them as a first measure. And additional indications for which people are using cross-linking is microbial keratitis, refractory microbial keratitis. Essentially, the UV rays are supposed to kill microbes, and it has shown some benefit in certain subset of patients. If people have also combined it with refractive corneal procedures like LASIK and PRK in borderline cases, but the evidence is not very strong for these. And also for bullous keratopathy to prevent the recurrent bullae formation, it has been used with some success. So there are mainly three elements when we are talking about collagen cross-linking. One is the UV light, one is oxygen, and riboflavin. People just often talk about UV light and riboflavin, but forget about oxygen. And without oxygen, that reaction cannot take place. You need oxygen for cross-linking to work. Okay, and that is why many of the procedures like transepithelial cross-linking don't work, because oxygen doesn't reach the site where you want the cross-linking. Several protocols have been described. The traditional protocol of cross-linking, which was originally started, was the Dresden protocol or the standard protocol. But several modifications have come, like the accelerated. We have modifications for thin cornea cross-linking, transepithelial cross-linking. When you combine cross-linking with an excimer procedure, and pulse cross-linking also is available. So how do you navigate this sea of protocols that are available, and how do you choose the right one for your particular patient? So the Dresden protocol was first described by Wolansak et al., in which they do a epithelial removal, apply 0.1% of riboflavin for 30 minutes, followed by irradiation with UVA of the fixed wavelength for another 30 minutes. The power of the cross-linking UV is 3 milliwatts per centimeter square, which comes to 5.4 joules per centimeter square. So we remove about 7 millimeters or 7 to 8 millimeters of the cornea, depending on the size of the cone. And this is how it's done. Okay, so every time before you do the procedure, you must make sure that you are calibrating the ultraviolet light. Then you scrape off the epithelium. You can use alcohol, or you can use some sort of a blade. And then you instill riboflavin. Earlier, the riboflavin included dextran, but nowadays we are using riboflavin with HPMC. The advantage is that dextran causes the cornea to become thinner, and you don't want it to become thinner in an already thin cornea, because that will also give you the possibility of irradiating the endothelium, which you don't want. And final step is, of course, UV irradiation. You have to make sure that the beam is at all times centered properly on the cornea, depending on the site of your ectasia and the site of your epithelial defect. So this is an important rule that we must remember, the Bunsen-Roscoe law of reciprocity. Basically, the same photochemical effect can be achieved by reducing the irradiation interval if you increase the energy, and vice versa. Okay, so basically, theoretically, you can use 3 milliwatts for 30 minutes, or you can use 30 milliwatts for 3 minutes. Although practically it doesn't exactly apply, but essentially that's what this law states, so that your net exposure is 5.4 joules per centimeter square. So these are the various protocols which can be used. So the traditional protocol is 3 milliwatts for 30 minutes, but the accelerated protocols are basically based on this Bunsen-Roscoe law. So you can use 10 milliwatts for 9 minutes, 5 milliwatts for 18 minutes, and 3 milliwatts for 30 milliwatts for 3 minutes. And essentially all of these will theoretically give you the same result, but in practical experience, we see that when you increase the energy and reduce the duration, then sometimes the CXL effect is not as good. And that mainly is because, probably because of the oxygen. So there have been several studies which have compared these different protocols, and it is clearly shown that the Dresden protocol is the most effective, and you have a decreasing effect as you reduce the duration. So probably a good balance would be the 9 milliwatt for 10 minutes if you want to kind of save time, but still get a fairly good amount of UV irradiation and cross-linking effect. So that's the one which I would recommend if you want to do accelerated cross-linking. And essentially, you should do this in children, in adults only. In children, if you do accelerated cross-linking, you know that the longevity and effectiveness is lesser in children. So you probably want to give them a full Dresden protocol, unless there's some other indication that child may not cooperate or something like that, that you need to hurry up the procedure. So there have been several studies which have shown that the cross-linking till 9 milliwatt works very well, and beyond that, the effect is not very good. And this was a nice study from the Narayan Netralaya group in India. So there is another modified accelerated protocol which has shown 18 milliwatts into 7 minutes instead of 5 minutes, and they have shown that even though you are giving that 7.45 joules per centimeter square instead of the 5.4, which should be traditionally given, the demarcation line is actually similar to what you would get for a 5 minute. So if you want to use a shorter duration with 18 milliwatt, instead of 5 minute, you can use a 7 minute and get an equally good effect, but save that additional 3 minutes instead of using 10 minutes with 9 milliwatts. Epithelial on cross-linking was in vogue some time back, but I think essentially most people have now given it up because it doesn't work as well. And this is because the penetration is not very good, both of the riboflavin and the oxygen through an intact epithelium. So if you have to do an epithelium on cross-linking, you had to use stronger concentration of riboflavin, and use the riboflavin used to be also having additional agents like BAK and EDTA, which enhance the penetration of riboflavin. So that way you are overcoming the barrier effect of the epithelium, but still the second problem of oxygen crossing the epithelium was always there. And that is why at least I have stopped doing epithelial non-cross-linking completely. Iontophoresis is another method of epithelium on cross-linking in which you use an electrical charge to facilitate the flow of riboflavin through the epithelium. And that works very well actually. Through the intact epithelium, the riboflavin reaches, but again, the same problem, oxygen doesn't reach as well. And that is why this also is not as effective as epi-off cross-linking, which is the standard cross-linking. So that's same thing being depicted. And basically what they've shown is that the amount of oxygen that reaches is 1x compared to 10x, which is taken up by the epithelium. So another new recent modification is the use of cross-linking for thinner cornea. So traditionally the limit for cross-linking is 400 microns. And if your cornea is lesser than 400 microns, you would not do it because it would be considered unsafe for the endothelium. So people have stretched that limit and taken it up to about 380 microns, but below 380, one could not do with the standard Dresden protocol. But now studies have shown that you have some alternatives. Earlier, people were trying to use hypotonic riboflavin to thicken the cornea. But the problem with hypotonic riboflavin is that the effect is very short-lived. So you have to either keep instilling it, or you have to, and then also you can't be sure because the cornea will become thin in between. So you might end up damaging the endothelium, and it's a very unpredictable way. So essentially this has been given up. People did try use of contact lenses, but again, contact lenses may, same problem of oxygen transmissibility was there, as well as the riboflavin was not reaching as well. So the effect in practical applications was not as good as epi-off cross-linking. People tried adding the shoe like a corneal lenticule, and that of course can work, but then you must realize that that lenticule which you're putting is eventually discarded. So that much of cross-linking effect is lost when you remove that lenticule. You could leave a little residual island at the kind of apex of the cone where the cornea is the thinnest, and you can do the rest of it. That's the Mazzotta technique. But essentially the place where you really need most cross-linking is not getting effective cross-linking because of that. The final technique, which I think is here to stay, is that of adapted fluence. And we have to thank Professor Hafezi from Switzerland for telling us about this. Essentially in this, what we are doing is we are reducing the overall fluence that we are giving. So instead of 5.4, you are giving it a smaller amount, maybe 4 or 3.5, depending on the thickness of the cornea. So basically, you are not changing the UV a power, which may be 3 milliwatt per centimeter square or say 9, whatever. But you are reducing the duration depending on the thickness. And studies have shown that this gives an equally good effect as a standard cross-linking in a thin cornea without having an effect on the endothelium and having a good demarcation line, just like you would get in a regular riboflavin. So you are using that same principle, but you're reducing the duration and essentially you're getting a very good effect. So that I think is the future. And there has recently been a paper which has come out from Dr. Hafezi's group, which has kind of shown this in a large series of patients. And they are able to do this for corneas sub 300 microns with wonderful effects, almost 265 microns if I'm not mistaken. So hypotonic riboflavin was basically riboflavin in sodium chloride, 0.9% with osmolarity of 310 milliosmoles per liter, epi of, and basically you have to initially instill the hypotonic riboflavin and then go for regular riboflavin and then cross-link. But I told you the problems with that. This is the protocol for contact lens assisted cross-linking from Dr. Agarwal's group. And they use specialized contact lenses which are not UV blocking. So some literature is there in evidence of this, but there's also literature showing that it doesn't work as well. This is the picture showing that epithelial island being left behind at the thinnest point. But again, it has questionable efficacy. So adapted fluence is what I like to use. A nice online calculator is available, which has been made by the Narayan Netralaya group, and that can be used, or you can refer the original paper from Farhad Hafezi's group. So this is the online calculator which is available called the Next Calculator. And you just have to input the patient's preoperative thickness, and it will tell you how much time for 3 milliwatts, 9 milliwatts, etc. So it becomes very easy essentially. So people have combined it with topographic guided cross-linking as well, and it certainly has a role. There are two protocols which are available. One is the Athens protocol, popularized by Kanellopoulos et al., and there is also the Cretan protocol. Cretan protocol is basically like a modified transepithelial PTK. Now, this does work, but the rationale is basically you're not trying to remove the refractive error, you're just trying to regularize the cornea so that you can improve the uncorrected and best corrected visual acuity. There has been some controversy about the role of mitomycin C, but initially people were using it, but recent papers have shown that mitomycin C actually increases the haze. So I have now stopped using mitomycin C when I combine these procedures. So Athens protocol, basically you do a maximum of 50 microns of ablation. So you do a topography guided PRK and make sure that the bed is about 400 microns. You can go below 400, but then you have to do an adapted fluence like I showed you in the previous talk. The Cretan protocol is basically a PTK in which when you're doing the PTK, you must remember that the epithelium is thinnest at the apex of the cone. So at that apex of the cone, you're shaving a little bit of the stroma to regularize the cone, and then you're doing a cross-linking. So just ablate about 10-15 microns of the stroma at the cone, and that is known to give a wonderful effect. The extra procedures, the evidence is very weak. I think it more makes you feel like you're adding some strengthening to the cornea, but one really doesn't know whether adding a small dose of cross-linking to a PRK or a LASIK or SMILE is really going to give you much, and we need more literature for this. I'll just take a few seconds more. People have also tried using pulsed light in which you don't give UV light throughout, but give it in pulses. And this has shown to have some effect. But again, you need a specialized machine for that. And not enough studies are available to show whether it really helps. Customized cross-linking, we use a specialized cross-linking machine in which you basically Avedro 2, in which you are giving more cross-linking at the apex of the cone and lesser as you go peripherally from the cone. So at the inner circle is 10 joules per centimeter square, and then a middle circle of 7.5 and an outer circle of 5.4. So advantage here is you induce more flattening at the apex of the cone, so it becomes flatter there, and thereby you're also doing some shape correction in addition to just cross-linking, and that might actually give you a refractive effect as well. So you're doing it in 3 kind of steps. And finally, people have combined it with keratitis with in refractory keratitis for treatment of microbial keratitis. The studies are mixed. It does have to seem to have some effect, but doesn't work for all cross-linkings. Variety of riboflavin solutions are available, epithelium for epithelium off and epithelium on, but essentially I think most of us are now using isotonic riboflavins. So this is how the evidence is stacked up. Only the ones on the top right are the ones that really have good evidence. And for everything else, I think the evidence is weak and we need more evidence before we can kind of adapt this. And this finally, I'll end with this. Now, a new machine has come in which you can cross-link on the slit lamp itself. Again, invented by Dr. Hafezi. And I think this might make it a procedure which is not just limited to people who have operation theaters. You can do it even in secondary centers which have just a slit lamp. And especially for people who are in very peripheral areas, this might be a good solution. So cross-linking, longer duration protocols are definitely more effective. It can be combined with surface ablation or intracorneal ring segments in selected cases. It may be useful for microbial keratitis, but we need more evidence. Adapted fluence is something which is exciting for thinner corneas, and slit lamp cross-linking might increase access and reduce the cost of this procedure. Thank you. Sorry for overshooting a little bit.
Thank you, sir. Sir, are you going to continue for for other talk as well? That is yours.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe start the timer.
Yeah. Shall I go on, Dr. Gantishore? Or?
You can go on.
Okay, sir, we'll start the timer as well. Thank you.
Is my presentation visible?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right. So my next talk is on the role of keratoplasty in ectasia. So this is the decision tree that I follow when I'm planning the management of ectasia. So if it is an ectasia alone, then you have to see how is the thickness of the cornea. If it is very thin cornea, then probably a predesmatic DALC or a penetrating keratoplasty might be better. So extreme ectasias. But if the thickness is quite good, then of course you can go for a traditional big bubble or a manual desmatic DALC, in which you can try to go down to the desmus level. Because if you have a very thin cornea, sometimes getting down to the desmus level and attempting a big bubble may be dangerous. If you have an ectasia along with a scar, a deep scar, or evidence of old hydrops like a scar in the desmus membrane, then such cases doing a desmatic DALC is risky. So one could do a penetrating keratoplasty or a mushroom kind of a keratoplasty. One can, of course, attempt a DALC also if the scar is not very significant, but one must remember that you may have a suboptimal visual outcome. And again, if you have a persistent hydrops and the cornea is edematous in spite of everything, and there's a large tear in the Duas layer, then in such cases, there's no choice, but you have to do a penetrating keratoplasty. So when we talk about advanced keratoconus, it's basically when the cone is either too thin or the cornea is too ectatic, or if the area of ectasia is too large in terms of the diameter. Corneal hydrops is a common occurrence, and persistence of edema is indicated by indicative of a desmus discontinuity or a severe endothelial injury. So why is an advanced keratoconus different? There's either too little stroma, so less working space for lamellar procedures. The desmus membrane is weakened because of extreme stretching, so it can rupture easily on touch. Desmus membrane and the Duas layer. There may be old hydrops or a deep scar. Again, high chance of desmus perforation during a deep lamellar dissection. And the cones may extend to the limbus, may be very peripheral, necessitating large or eccentric grafts, which in case of a penetrating keratoplasty will be a risk factor for rejection. It's important to assess these corneas carefully on the slit lamp and with diagnostic procedures to look at the size and location of the cone. Specifically look for deep scars near the desmus membrane, which may be a marker of old hydrops, or any irregularity of the descemet's membrane, proximity to the limbus, and the severity of thinning. OCT is a very, very useful tool, especially in the management of keratoconus, to look at several aspects. One is to look at the thinness pachymetry, because it gives you a thick pachymetry map as well. Look at the location of the thinning, the extent of thinning. Look at the depth of the disease, and look for deep scars and descemet's membrane irregularity. So this is just some OCT images in which you can see here on the pachymetry map, you can see how widespread and how thin the cornea is. In this case, the thinnest point is 183 microns, which is fairly thin. And again, a large part of that 183 would also be epithelium. So, introducing a needle or a cannula might be a little tricky in this kind of a situation. Measure the actual stromal thickness. You can see in this case, the epithelium is quite irregularly thickened, and that might give you a false sense of security when you're doing the procedure. These are all images showing old hydrops. So you can see deep scar in the bottom left image, and all three other images show irregularity in the descemet's membrane, indicating that there's been a hydrops. And in such a case, if you try to do a descemetic dissection for DALC, you will end up with a perforation. So if you don't have any of these problems, and of course, DALC is the ideal procedure of choice, and the most popular procedure of deep lamellar keratoplasty is a big bubble DALC, in which essentially you're introducing a big bubble of air in the deep stroma, and that kind of separates the stroma from the pre-descemetic Duas layer. And once you've done that, you're essentially dissecting out the stroma anterior to that in a kind of a pie-shaped fashion to kind of show the bare Duas layer, which appears as a nice clean layer, like is shown in the video on the right. But it may not be possible in very extreme ectasias because of the paucity of stroma. So then you may have to think of additional procedures. I often do a manual DALC in these extreme corneas because in my hands that is more predictable, and you have a safer outcome. So you have to, in the procedure that I follow, which is called the groove and peel technique, I do a partial thickness definition depending on the extent of the cone. So here you can see I've marked out the extent of the cone with the gentian violet marker. And then you do a scissor dissection. So you go in with a closed blade and then you open it and you kind of just go all around. And then you keep going in a deeper circumferential dissection underneath the definition mark, like is shown here. And as you keep going, spiraling deeper and deeper, at some point, you will find the shiny pre-descemetic Duas layer. And at this point, you can actually hold that central island of descemet's membrane, of stroma, and peel it off the Duas layer in the descemet's membrane. So basically, you're using traction forces to do the peeling in the central cornea, and dissection is all done in the peripheral cornea, as you could see in the video. And because you're using traction forces which are distributed over a large surface area, all these fine attachments between the stroma and the Duas layer are easily separated, as you can see in this particular video. And you can just peel the whole thing off and open up this potential space very nicely. Once you've done that, you take the stromal button and then peel the descemet's membrane off it from the endothelial side, like was shown here, and then you put the button in place and suture it. So that's quite simple. If you have a very young donor, sometimes the peeling the descemet's membrane is not very easy and it may have to be removed piecemeal. So this is just another patient with a keratoglobus kind of a picture. As you can see, the cornea is extremely thin and the stroma is actually having no attachments to the pre-descemetic layer and just peels off like a LASIK flap. It's okay to leave behind a little bit of stroma if you have a very extreme kind of a ectasia with a very thin cornea, because in such cases, you just don't want to have a perforation. Here's a case in which we have a perforation while we're trying to peel. This was a patient who had an old hydrop. So the learning lesson, never try a descemetic kind of a dissection if you have an attachment of the deep layers to the descemet's membrane or the Duas layer. But the good news is, in spite of perforation, you can manage to complete these cases as a lamellar procedure in almost 90% of cases with wonderful outcomes. You can see in this case, the cornea was very clear very soon post-operatively. This is just another representative picture of how clear deep lamellar keratoplasty corneas can look. On just the first postoperative day, you can see the bubble of air is just there. It looks like a penetrating keratoplasty. So you can see we use a large graft, and normally if you would do a penetrating keratoplasty of such a big size, you would end up with a rejection eventually. But here, because it was a DALP, this patient did beautifully well. And rejection is very rare in these cases. So penetrating keratoplasty does have a role. Earlier, people were doing it very often, especially if they are not proficient in DALP. But I think in today's day and age, you are doing a disservice to this patient, and he might come back to you many years later and ask you, why did you do a penetrating procedure? And I've ended up with a failed graft. You should have done a DALP. And if not him, somebody else will tell him that your first surgeon has done a disservice. So in today's day, I think if unless indicated, penetrating keratoplasty should not be done for any ectasias. But it does have a role. If you have central scars, especially those involving the descemet's membrane or deeper layers, and if you have old persisting hydrops with continuing edema of the cornea, then you don't really have a choice. So some of the tips when you're doing penetrating keratoplasty in these eyes: collapse the cone. You can use a cautery to actually apply directly over the cone and it can shrink. The advantage of doing that is trephination becomes a lot more controlled. Otherwise, if you have very ectatic cornea, you'll end up trephining eccentrically. Encompass the entire cornea. That's very, very important. If you don't remove the entire diseased cornea, you will have a recurrence of ectasia either in the graft-osed junction or beyond it. Avoid oversizing in ectasias because these are very stretched out corneas. If you just do an oversized cornea, then you may end up with a myopic refractive surprise. You can go with the same size graft or oversize very little, maybe about 0.25. Femto-assisted grafts are probably a better idea because the endothelium is largely healthy in these eyes and the problem is in the stroma. So if you use a femto, you can go for a mushroom kind of a configuration in which you do more of the anterior layers. So this is one patient of mine who had a very, very bad persisting hydrops. And you can see that there's a big tear in the Degois layer and extremely hydrated cornea. So in such a case, there's no point doing a DALP. You have to do a penetrating keratoplasty. Now, earlier I didn't know better, but now today I would just do a penetrating keratoplasty in the area of the perforation. In this case, because the whole cornea was so edematous and scarred, I did a large diameter graft, as you will see soon. So it's like a regular PKA, and you can see that the large graft well sutured, and this patient did quite well for many, many years. You can see a very nice clear graft, 2025, but eventually he ended up with a rejection and we had to do a DSEC underneath this graft. This is another very interesting case. Patient came with a large hydrops kind of a picture involving the central and the inferior cornea. So my clinical impression was that this patient probably had a peripheral ectasia, which has then resulted in a hydrops, which is also involved the central cornea. And we kind of, did a intracameral C3F8 injection in this particular eye to help reduce the hydrops. And then we ended up with this kind of a cornea, which was very scarred in the center and also had some sort of some element of edema also. So you can see that central cornea is quite scarred, involving the deeper layers. And this was involving the descemet's membrane. So there was no way that a DALP could work, and I had to do a penetrating keratoplasty. But I didn't want to do such a large diameter DALP because this patient essentially had a pellucid as well in the inferior cornea, which you can see in this image. So I did something different, which was a split mushroom graft, which was done manually. So I did a large diameter anterior stromal trephination, and I essentially dissected the anterior stroma off layer by layer, as you can see in this video. And once the anterior stroma was taken off, a large chunk of it, I decided to do a central endothelial graft within that. So I took a donor cornea, mounted in an artificial anterior chamber, did the dissection like I would do for a DSEC. And then I went back to the recipient cornea and did a small 6 millimeter central trephination like so. So basically I took out that central cornea, which was unhealthy, and took the donor dissected lenticule from the artificial anterior chamber and took a central 6 millimeter graft like this. And then I put the large diameter 9.5 or 10 millimeter graft, anterior lamellar graft on top of this and sutured it. And you can see we got a very good outcome. I had, of course, put an air bubble to keep that endothelial graft in place, but then basically this was like combining an endothelial graft with a large anterior stromal graft. So it was actually the best of both worlds. And this patient has recently come to me and he has 20/20 vision in this eye and is extremely happy and almost 5 years post-op. Femto-assisted grafts are a very, very useful thing in keratoconus. And here I'm doing a femto deep lamellar keratoplasty. So you can see a mushroom configuration has been done. And you can see that on the right, we got a very good, well-opposed graft. And this patient did very well. So to conclude, surgical intervention is indicated in ectasia when contact lens fitting is not possible or the patient is not tolerating it. Especially if there's a risk of hydrops or there's a pre-existing hydrops or in case of central scars. The choice of keratoplasty will depend on the factors like I mentioned earlier, the extent of thinning, presence of central scars, involvement of deep stroma, etc. Penetrating keratoplasty can be done in some selected indications like long-standing hydrops and central scars. And deep lamellar keratoplasty, although technically challenged, it will eventually result in a wonderful outcome in most of these patients. I've done hundreds in keratoconus with excellent results. And later you can go on and do a correction of any residual error with a surface ablation. Topography guided ablations can be done to give very good unaided as well as best corrected vision in these patients. And you have extremely satisfied patients. Thank you. So I made up for the excess time I took in the previous talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rishi, for the same. The panel is open for discussion until 3:55. I won't take your time at all.
Dr. Nandkishore, I'll just... Hello? Dr. Nandkishore, we can't hear you. You're not audible, Dr. Nandkishore?
Dr. Nandkishore, if you could just unmute once.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't see any questions. So if I can initiate some kind of discussion, I think it would be good. To Lumbini and Dr. Rishi, would you modify your TCAT procedure or a topography guided ablation along with the C3R based on the thickness and the refractive element?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Actually, I couldn't cover it in my talk because it would have become too long. Each machine has its own technique of how to plan the topography guided ablation in a case of cross-linking, in a case of keratoconus. The important thing to remember, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. The important thing to remember whenever we are doing a combined procedure, when we combine laser with a cross-linking in keratoconus, is that the objective is not to make the patient emmetropic. That is very, very important. Okay, even if you have the option of making it, don't stretch the limits. Always remember your only objective is to regularize the irregular astigmatism which is there in these corneas, so that you are improving the best corrected vision. And of course, there will also be some improvement of uncorrected vision. But ultimately, the objective is that with the glass or a soft contact lens, the patient should be able to see without needing a RGP or a scleral lens or any of the other lenses. So in the machine that we are using, the Schwind, they have a planning software. And in that, what we have to do is basically we have to use specialized buttons in that, which will help to reduce the amount of stromal ablation. So essentially, you are selectively selecting some of the aberrations so that you are correcting the large amount of irregular astigmatism, but not all of them, because it will come at the cost of stromal ablation. So you just want to regularize the cornea to the extent possible. And each machine has its own protocol. Schwind has its own, and EX500 has its own protocol, and I'm sure the other Bausch & Lomb machine, etc., has its own way. So you'll have to customize it based on that. Basically, you enter the refractive error minimum and enter about 1/3 or 50% or 1/3 of your cylinder. That's what I start with. And the minimal refractive error, as you can, depending on how much cornea you have. Then you see how much residual stroma you're getting. And if you have enough residual stroma, then you can first increase the cylinder till a maximum of 2/3 of the value of the cylinder. And then you go to the sphere. That's the way that I start. You can even start with plano. Even that is okay. Start with plano. See how the ablation pattern is matching your cone and how much of residual error you're getting at the thinnest point. And based on that, you can keep increasing the cylinders gradually and then go to the sphere. Cylinder don't correct maximum up to 2/3. So that is the way that I plan. And the optic zone again will have to be planned depending upon the type of cone that you have and the location of the cone.
Dr. Lumbini, your take on this?
I have absolutely no practical experience. It's just the theoretical knowledge. So
Yeah, the protocol which Narayan Netralaya mentions is they take less than 6 diopters and more than 6 diopters, and a Pachy of 475 and less than 475. So if the Pachy is 475, around 475, and the power is less than 6, they attempt a refractive correction. But if it is more than that, they just try to give some sort of correction, regularization, by altering just the Q value. That is, and also it also depends on the size of the location of the cone. If it is central or whether it is outside the 2 or 3 millimeter zone.
Yes, Dr. Murli,
I was trying to say, I mean, we've been using, some of us on the Schwind Amaris, the apical reshaping.
Yeah,
and that has worked quite well actually. And when I combine it with PRK and apical reshaping followed by cross-linking, I've seen some fairly good results. So I don't know what you people.
So I have also done that a few times, but my only problem with that is it's a little bit of a guesswork. It is not very precise.
Yes.
So when you're doing a topography guided, it is very precise. So you can actually get a better refractive outcome in my experience doing a topography guided. Trek also works. It's like a modification of the Preton protocol in which you're doing a focal PTK only at the cone. Yes.
The other option is, of course, instead of saying Q value, you can just remove the spherical and the coma, which that facility you have in the Schwind platform. Dr. Murli, regarding these special lenses, how often do you have to change them?
It's something which as per the recommendations of the company, you have to discard them every 6 months. But we tell them to go on for a year if they can maintain well. Whereas on the other hand, Rose K XL lenses can go on for a couple of years or more than that if they can be maintained well. But the drawback is, of course, the comfort with the clear cone lens is way better than with the XL lenses.
And have you ever done where you were not able to fit in the initial sitting? Have you gone for a regularization of the cornea and then got back to fitting a contact lens?
Many patients that I see where the keratoconus is progressing, we do the cross-linking for them. And then after 6 months, minimum of 3 to 6 months, we fit them with contact lenses. So it's worked quite well.
Rishi, have you any experience with intracorneal segments?
Yes, sir. I have used quite a few intracorneal ring segments. And so the thing with intracorneal ring segments is the results are a little unpredictable. sometimes they work so well that you want to do it for every single patient. And sometimes you just don't get any effect at all. So that is my only problem with them is that they are unpredictable. And second is the cost, especially if you want to use Intacs, they're quite expensive. So I currently use the ones from Biotech, which are much cheaper. Those also seem to be working okay.
Ekta, can we have a couple of minutes?
Sir, I am so sorry, but I am not allowed to extend the hall timings. I am not authorized to do so.
Because we don't have any session after this.
I understand, sir, but I'm not allowed to extend the hall timings. I can maybe give you 2 more minutes. Timer can have 2 more minutes and
Yeah.
then we can use the session.
Or stretch it to 5 minutes.
Sir, I am very sorry.
Okay. Lumbini, you were saying something.
Sir, I have one question for Dr. Rishi. Sir, what is the minimum age you have done cross-linking for pediatric age group?
I don't remember exactly, but I think it was around 9.
And do you prefer general anesthesia in such patients?
So most kids I've seen, you can actually manage to do in topical. So you have to assess if you feel. I have done a few kids in general anesthesia. So of course 8 and 9 you will have to do, but I think 12 onwards you can cajole them and if necessary keep the parent in the operation theater and distract them. You can manage in topical because I don't really find it worthwhile exposing them to that risk. You can also sedate them instead of giving general anesthesia to make them a little more cooperative. The drops can be put outside. We waste a lot of time in drops on the table. So what you can do is just take them on table, remove the epithelium, and then instill the drops in the OPD, and then take the child again back on the table for the UV. And if you feel that such a child may not cooperate for long, then you could use the accelerated protocol of 9 milliwatts for 10 minutes. But in general, I like to use the full protocol for kids.
I've done for a 12-year-old who cooperated very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, 12 years and 10 years were okay. Sir, I had a patient who was 8 years, so I was wondering whether we should go for general anesthesia.
Yeah. I've done 3-4 patients in GA. It's perfectly fine. You can even do both eyes on the same day.
Okay, both.
Actually, one fast question.
Yeah.
If you are doing a intracorneal segment, would you do C3R before or after? Because there's a lot of controversy about that.
So ideal is to do along with it. The only problem with doing simultaneously is in the area of the ring, you should not be putting the UV light. Otherwise, sometimes you can develop sterile infiltrates along the rings. So then your pathology might be beyond that central zone, but you will not be able to cross-link them. So presently, what I'm doing is a combined procedure, but probably it may be a good idea to do afterwards. But then the efficacy of the ring is further reduced if you do it after cross-link.
Okay, thank you, Ekta, for allowing that extra 2 minutes. And I'm thankful to all my co-instructors. I hope it was a reasonably good session.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
Wonderful
much.
session. I hope we had some audience. How many did we have, Ekta? Could you able to tell us?
About 12.
Sorry, sir.
No, not here. This is not here. No, this is not the audience link is different. How many were there in the audience link?
For
Viewers?
this session, sir?
Yes.
Sir, it was only all of us, the speakers and you and my AV team. That's it. We didn't really have any attendees.
My God.
That's all.
Okay.
All right, sir.
As well
Okay.
had a separate session.
Yeah, on WhatsApp. Okay, goodbye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Rishi. Thank you, Dr. A.M. Murli ji. Thank you, Dr. Lumbini. Thank you, Dr. Nandkishore.
Thank
And
you.
I'll also thank both my timekeeper as well as Vijay ji because they have been of great help. With this, we close the session and I hope to see you all tomorrow on the last day of AIOC at my hall.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.